It's my pleasure today to talk to you about insects and pesticides. And I thought it would be important to start by just explaining why insects are important, particularly pollinators. But pollination is not the only benefit that insects give us. So by way of introduction, I've always been fascinated by insects. They're incredibly diverse creatures. They've been around for about 500 million years, and they've evolved into an incredible diversity of different shapes and sizes and colors. We know of about 1.1 million different species of insect on our planet, and they perform all sorts of different ecological roles. So, for example, they're important as food for many larger creatures: birds, bats, reptiles and amphibians and freshwater fish all feed upon insects. So if insects were to disappear, then all of these creatures would also disappear. But insects aren't just important as food. They perform many other important ecological roles, things like helping to control crop pests, recycling of animal dung and dead leaves and dead bodies and trees and all sorts of organic material. And they help to keep the soil healthy. They distribute seeds. And of course, they're vitally important as pollinators. Many people mistakenly think that pollination is all done by bees. Bees are very important pollinators, and it's important to remember that there are lots of different types of bees, not just honeybees, but many species of wild bee, about 25,000 species of bee that we know of in the world. But then there are many, many other pollinating insects that are also important. Moths, butterflies, flies of different types, beetles and wasps and so on. And between them, they pollinate the flowers of 80% of all the plant species on the planet. So it's impossible to exaggerate how important that is ecologically. And from a human perspective, of course, pollination is vitally important. Roughly 3/4 of the crop varieties that we grow in the world wouldn't give a full harvest, and some of them would produce nothing without being pollinated by insects. So we've become used to our shops being full of produce, all sorts of different produce from different parts of the world. But if one were to take away insect pollinators, then things wouldn't look so good. We would have far fewer apples, cherries, strawberries, blueberries, tomatoes, pumpkins. I could go on. Even things like chocolate and coffee are pollinated by different types of insects. So it's hard to imagine a world without either of those. The reality is we could not feed the global population without insect pollinators. So hence we should be really concerned that there is clear evidence that insect pollinators are in decline. Now, I'm not going to talk at length about this. I think the evidence is quite clear. I just want to give one example of one of the more dramatic pieces of evidence for insect declines. And this is the well-known German study, sometimes called the Krefeld study, which is based on German entomologists, insect enthusiasts, running malaise traps on nature reserves all across Germany. That's a malaise trap top right there, and it's a trap that catches all types of flying insect. And what the graph shows you is the biomass of flying insects caught per trap per day, and how that changed between 1989 and 2016, which is a 27-year period. And you can see it fell over time. Actually, on average, the biomass of insects caught fell by 76%. So it seems that 3/4 of German insects disappeared in just 27 years. Now, all the evidence we have is that that is not something peculiar that's happening in Germany, that this is a general phenomenon, at least across Europe and North America, and probably elsewhere, although we have much fewer data from other countries. So why are insects in rapid decline? Well, there are many drivers of insect declines. It's certainly not all due to pesticides, but there is little doubt that pesticides are a significant contributor to insect declines. And I just want to go back in to give some sort of perspective here. This is not a new phenomenon, clearly. The first person to really highlight the dangers of pesticides was Rachel Carson, an American biologist who published her famous book, Silent Spring, in 1962, 61 years ago. And she explained the harm that pesticides, which at the time were relatively new, they'd been in operation really since the Second World War. So she was writing 20 years later. And she described how pesticide use was poisoning wildlife, poisoning livestock, farm animals, and farmers, and causing tremendous ecological damage. And it was very controversial at the time. She was widely criticized by the agrochemical industry for what she said. But eventually it became clear that what she said was true, and many of those early pesticides were banned, things like DDT and some of the organophosphate pesticides. And I think many people concluded that the problem had been solved, that we'd got rid of the bad pesticides and all was well. But actually, I think the situation has got much worse since Rachel Carson's day. And I think she would be horrified if she had lived to see what happened after publication of Silent Spring. Global use of pesticides has continued to climb year on year. We now use globally at least 3 million tons of pesticides annually. And when Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, she was in the United States, where she was based. There were 37 different pesticides available to farmers, 37. Today in the United States, there are nearly 1,000 different pesticides available to farmers. The figure for the European Union is more like 500, but it's still an awful lot of different chemicals going into the landscape. Anyway, I wanted to focus today on one particular group of pesticides, which are the most controversial ones when it comes to insect declines. And they're a group that I've been doing research on now for more than 10 years. This is the neonicotinoids, a class of insecticides that were invented fairly recently. They were first used in Europe in 1994. As the name suggests, they're related to nicotine. They're chemical synthetic variants of nicotine, which is, of course, a chemical that tobacco plants produce to kill insects to protect themselves. Neonicotinoids have proved to be very popular. They make up now about 25% of the global market for insecticides. There are 6 main neonicotinoids. I've listed them there. They have these long names that are very hard to pronounce and remember. And I have heard it suggested that that's a deliberate strategy by the industry to stifle discussion. Whether that's true, I don't know. Anyway, the main use in Europe is as seed dressings. You can see there, top right, that blue stuff. Those are seeds of oilseed rape, which are coated in insecticide, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But neonicotinoids are also sprayed and used as soil drenches, and also applied to domestic pets, actually, but that's another story. So they've proved very popular with farmers and become one of the most widely used insecticides available. Neonicotinoids are very toxic to insects. So, of course, they're meant to be insecticides, so that shouldn't come as a huge surprise. But nonetheless, the degree of toxicity is quite hard to understand or explain. So here I've put the LD50, the lethal dose that kills 50% of honeybees, a standard test animal for insecticides. And imidacloprid, the top of the list there, is one of these neonicotinoids. And I put 3 other insecticides for comparison. And you can see that the dose needed to kill a honeybee is much smaller for imidacloprid than for the other insecticides. In fact, neonicotinoids, most of them, are about 7,000 times more poisonous to bees than DDT, which was one of the chemicals that Rachel Carson wrote about. So that means that a small spoonful of neonicotinoid, 5 grams, would be enough to give a lethal dose to 1.25 billion honeybees. So it doesn't take much of these chemicals. They're neurotoxins. They're a bit like Novichok for humans. They attack the brain of the insect and paralyze and kill it at tiny, tiny doses. Now, I mentioned that they're primarily used as seed dressings. And so this diagram is meant to show the environmental fate of neonicotinoids when they're applied. So we have the seed coated in insecticide, which is the farmer buys it pre-coated, and he sows it in the ground. And the idea is that the seed coating dissolves in the soil water, and then the little plant, as it grows up, the seedling, sucks up the pesticide from the soil, and it permeates the plant, goes to all parts of the plant and makes it poisonous to insect pests, which sounds like quite a nice idea. The problem is, it turns out that only a tiny proportion of the insecticide is actually going into the crop, about 5% on average. Most of it goes into the soil, where it can accumulate if the pesticides are used year after year. So the levels in soil build up steadily over time if a treated crop is applied. And just as the crop can take up the pesticide from the soil, so can any other plants with their roots in that soil. So if a farmer has a wildflower strip next to his field of crops, then they too will become contaminated with these insecticides, which spread to all parts of the plant, including the nectar and the pollen. So hedgerow plants, trees, any plants in an agricultural landscape where neonicotinoids are being used will be systemically permeated with these incredibly toxic pesticides. They also leach downhill with the water and go into streams and rivers and cause tremendous problems there. One of the best known examples of which is Lake Shinji in Japan. This is the biggest freshwater lake in Japan. And what this chart shows you is the abundance of zooplankton, little creatures, insects and crustaceans in the lake over time and how it changed. And the big arrow shows you when the Japanese started using neonicotinoids on the rice paddy fields around the lake. And the neonicotinoids got into the water, flowed into the lake, and essentially wiped out the zooplankton, which caused a complete collapse of the fisheries because the fish had nothing to eat. And the entire lake wildlife was profoundly affected by this pollution and has remained so ever since. Neonicotinoids aren't just a problem for aquatic systems, of course. This shows you neonicotinoids in honey samples. Each little dot on this map is a honey sample collected from honeybees around the world. And this study shows that basically honeybees are being poisoned by neonicotinoids pretty much everywhere in the world. The white samples were clean ones. The ones with varying shades, the darker colors, are all ones contaminated with neonicotinoids. Now I'm nearly out of time, but I just wanted to quickly share with you the pesticide industry will say, well, this is all very well, but these concentrations are too low to do any harm to real bees. These are just tiny, tiny traces of pesticide. Well, that simply isn't true. And I haven't got time to explain this in depth, but one of the first experiments my research group did on this subject was back in 2012, where we wanted to understand what the effect on a bumblebee nest would be of being near a treated crop field that flowered that they visited. So we exposed bumblebee nests to concentrations that are well within the range of concentrations that we now know are found in honeybee honey. We had nests, control nests, and nests exposed to field realistic doses and nests exposed to a higher dose. And this just shows you the weights of the bumblebee nests as they grew over time. The control nests got much heavier than the treated nests. And bumblebee nests have to produce new queens at the end of the summer because the nests die off. They only live for a few months, and it's the new queens that will start new nests the following spring. And this just shows you the number of queens produced. The control nests produce lots of queens. The ones exposed to field realistic doses of neonicotinoids produced very few, or most of them actually no queens. There was an 85% reduction. And this is just one study. There are many, many others, now hundreds of studies showing quite clearly that the landscape scale use of neonicotinoids is impacting on different groups of wildlife. So these, I could have shown you many other studies, but here are studies showing that neonicotinoids cause declines of aquatic invertebrates, of insect-eating birds, that their use correlates with death of honeybee colonies, with the rates of decline of wild bees, and with rates of decline of butterflies in the UK and also in California. It is beyond doubt at this point in time that neonicotinoids are a really significant driver of insect declines around the world. And we really do need to ban them now, as the European Union essentially already has, but use continues in my own country in particular. Now we've left the EU. And it's time the whole world woke up to the harm these pesticides are doing. It's complete madness to be poisoning our pollinators. And on that note, I'd better finish. I've overrun slightly. I do apologize. Thank you very much for listening to me.